not having a domestic source of supply for salmon when there's a market of 400,000 metric tons also leads us to retailers and restaurants that really do want a domestic source of supply. And we don't have one. And so this kind of farming provides that, and it's in a very environmentally responsible way, which is also important.
Welcome to Seeking Alpha's CEO interviews, informed conversations with the best and brightest CEOs in the publicly traded markets. Quality of leadership is a decisive factor in stock performance. Our show provides intimate and in-depth investing discussions with industry leaders across all sectors of the marketplace. We publish excerpts on social media platforms and the full conversations on seekingalpha.com or on our highly rated Seeking Alpha mobile app under CEO interviews.
Welcome to Seeking Alpha. I'm your host, Jesse Redmond. Today, I'm joined by Sylvia Wulf, CEO of AquaBounty. Sylvia, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jesse. Happy to be here.
So why don't you start off providing us with an introduction? How would you describe AquaBounty to somebody that maybe wasn't as familiar with the story?
AquaBounty is really a pioneer in terms of the area of aquaculture and genetics as they're being used in aquaculture. We're the first genetically engineered animal that was approved for food use. It's our salmon. And we grow it in land-based undercover tank farms. And what that allows us to do is to create a salmon that's biosecure. So no antibiotics, no contaminants, no chemicals. And the genetic engineering that really allows us to do that productively and sustainably was the result of research that was done at Memorial University in Canada 30 years ago. So if you think about it, our fish are actually the same as they were 30 years ago when a Chinook gene was inserted into an Atlantic salmon. And now they're specifically designed to grow well and use less resources the way we farm today.
And how big is the global salmon market? It seems like it's a super popular fish when you go to any store, from your more budget type stores all the way up to your high-end Whole Foods type stores. It seems like you always see salmon, a lot of different levels to it, a lot of different price points. But can you talk a little bit about how big the global salmon market is? And then also add, what do you think a reasonable penetration rate is for you?
The market in the US, which is the one that we're focused on today, we import 400,000 metric tons of Atlantic salmon. That's the farm species. It's 97% of the demand for salmon in this country, and wild caught salmon, which a lot of people think about, is only about 3% of what we eat in the US. So we see a real opportunity to create a domestic source of supply in those markets like the US, who are net importers of salmon. The global market for salmon is growing roughly 5 to 7% per year. And so there's plenty of room for new types of farming, new sources of supply, and shifting production like what we're talking about doing by bringing domestic sources of supply and production to a market like the US.
And do you give thought to what a reasonable penetration rate is? Is it, I assume it's something like a fraction of 1% is still a huge number just because you're talking about such a massive market. Do you give any thought to how much of that market you might be able to dig into?
So if you think that the US market is growing roughly 5% per year on 400,000 tons, what we plan to do is actually build farms that'll give us about 50,000 metric tons of supply to this market. So you're absolutely right. It's just a fraction of what we're going to do. And the beautiful thing about what we're talking about is we're going to participate in the growth and not about taking share from others. There's plenty of room for new sources of supply. It's a healthy protein, and global demand continues to grow.
And what are the biggest benefits of the AquaBounty salmon? What are the environmental benefits, and why might consumers like it more?
The original intent of the research that was done at Memorial University was to find a way to protect juvenile salmon when they move from where they're grown in nurseries to net pens. And what was happening is when you go to net pens, which is the traditional form of aquaculture and salmon farming, they're subject to extreme weather events. And what salmon don't do when they're very young is they don't eat if it's too cold or too warm. And so they have a high mortality rate. And so what the researcher was trying to do was find a way to protect those salmon in their early vulnerable stages. And what he did was he took a Chinook salmon gene, a growth hormone gene, and he embedded it in the genetic structure of an Atlantic salmon. And what that allows the salmon to do is to continue to eat during those early vulnerable stages. And so it protects it from mortality. Now you fast forward to where we are today. We don't have any intention of farming salmon in net pens. There's always the concern of escape and, what it would do to wild populations. That was never our intent. And now what we have is a salmon that grows faster in its earlier stages, and it allows us to be able to produce more of that healthy protein for the same capital investment. And the other benefit of our fish is that they're highly efficient in the way that they utilize their feed. So they require less than a pound of feed to produce a pound of biomass. And so if you think about that, it really is less strain on natural resources, more of a healthy protein produced for the same footprint and same investment. And then when you think about the way that we farm specifically, we're recirculating 95 to 99% of the water in our farms. And so we're very cognizant of utilizing natural resources very sparingly.
And how much more quickly are these salmon growing? Isn't that one of the big benefits, is that the fish is it bigger in a shorter amount of time? So it's a very efficient form of farming. Can you talk about how much more quickly they're growing, how much more they weigh?
Mm-hmm. So they don't grow larger, they just grow faster.
Okay.
Because when they reach harvest weight, you're going to harvest them the same as you would in a net pen. But when you compare, so I'll give you 2 points of reference. When you compare to net pens, because the environmental conditions are unstable, you don't know, you can't predict with accuracy how long it's going to take the salmon to reach a harvest weight. So it's anywhere from, say, 28 to 30 months. Our salmon grows to harvest weight in 18 to 19 months. Now, if you compare our salmon in the same environment, so there are others in the industry that are farming in what we call recirculating aquaculture systems, but they're using conventional salmon or non-transgenic salmon. And it takes them 26 to 28 months to reach harvest weight. So you can see we have about a 70% advantage with our growth rates. And then you add on top of that, that they eat less to reach that harvest weight.
And why are they eating less to reach the harvest weight? What's the underlying thing that's going on there?
So the genetic modification also gave us a salmon that's highly efficient in the way that they utilize their feed. So they just require less to get to the same harvest weight, which is a real benefit when you think about the environmental implications of that.
And can you talk a bit about how you're raising the salmon and how many facilities you have? It sounds like the ocean cages aren't an option for this, and maybe you could articulate a bit about why that might not be the best solution here.
So we farm in what we call land-based recirculating aquaculture systems. So think of it like a big tank farm under roof, but highly biosecure. So the salmon are raised in a precision environment. They get the right water quality, the right kind of feed, the right kind of movement in the tanks. And so they school and swim naturally, just like you'd expect a salmon to school and swim. But they do it in these very, very large tanks where we control the conditions. That allows us to protect them from disease and predators and environmental, or call it extreme weather conditions. So that's a real advantage when we think about going forward. Now, what we are required to do, because we are actually regulated by the FDA as, believe it or not, an animal drug. 25 years ago, when we began the regulatory approval process, there really wasn't one available for genetically engineered animals that were designed for food use. And so we followed the path for an animal biotech pharmaceutical product. That requires the FDA to approve our facilities, and they make sure that it's safe for us as people, safe for the fish, and most importantly, safe for the environment. And that requires us to have about 6 levels of physical containment in our farms to make sure that there's no escape. What we farm currently are sterile females. So we're vertically integrated and we own our own brood stock. They live in Canada in our farm on Rollo Bay on Prince Edward Island. And so what happens is we bring the eggs into our farms. They then are the fertilized eggs, and then they hatch, and then they grow to harvest weight within that land-based structure. And so we've never had an escape in 25 years, given the levels of physical containment and the fact that they're sterile females. There's no risk to native salmon populations, because even if they did escape, they can't breed.
And is there any difference in the taste if they were raised in the ocean versus these land-based ponds?
No, we've compared to Atlantic salmon, and they're, for all intents and purposes, identical to Atlantic salmon. They, again, we think we have a slightly cleaner flavor because we can manage the water conditions of the salmon, but they really are what they eat. And so they have a specially formulated diet depending on the growth, where they are in their growth cycle, but very similar to what Atlantic salmon eat.
And how is the adoption going? Is there interest in what I would call GMO salmon, and how much of it have you been able to sell?
So we started harvesting from our Indiana and Prince Edward Island facilities the middle part of 2021, and everything that we've harvested has been sold. One of the things that we did about 3 years ago was really try to understand what consumers were concerned about, because there's been a lot of anti-GMO activism, but a lot of it is really misinformation. I mean, we wouldn't have the affordable and accessible food supply we have today without GMOs. And so what we learned from consumers is, yes, there's a very vocal minority that just is opposed to anything genetically modified, but it's not based on science. GMOs are safe for consumption. And then the second concern is, what happens with escapes. We precluded that with the containment of our facilities and the sterility of our females. But what we found was about 80% of consumers, once they understand what we did and why we did it, and the fact that it's affordable, accessible, and tastes good, they were willing to buy it. We had a 70% purchase intent. So what that told us is, if we can simply tell the story of what we did and why and the benefit to a consumer, they're more than willing to give it a try. And then it all hinges on the price and taste.
And here comes a couple of the tougher questions here, Sylvia, so
Okay.
get ready. Okay. To fund the business, you've done a number of equity raises. Shares outstanding in 2017 were about 9 million. Today, they're closer to 70 million shares outstanding. While this provides the necessary capital, existing investors continually get diluted in this scenario. Where do you stand today with the cash position, and what can investors expect moving forward in terms of capital raises and potential additional dilution?
We did a series of capital raises the end of 2021, or during 2021 and early 2020 and early 2021. And the purpose of those capital raises was actually to fund the large scale farm that we're building in Ohio. We've been very deliberate about who we've talked to during those equity raises, because we have a very long runway to cash flow break even. And so telling the story to investors and helping them understand that we won't see that until sometime in 2025 makes us attractive to a certain type of investor, particularly an impact investor who cares about environmental social governance. And so they understood why we were doing the raises, which was to fund the farm, to get us to the point of cash flow break even. And that's exactly what we've done. We have a very strong balance sheet right now. We also were approved for $300 billion worth of bond financing by the Toledo-Lucas County Port Authority. And so we'll contribute about $150 million to the cost of our farm in Ohio, and then use some of that bond financing to fund the remainder. It's about a $300 million capital investment. And so, yes, there's always a concern about dilution, but given the type of investor that's most interested in what we do, they understand why we did what we did and the fact that it's a long time horizon to cash flow break even.
And what's the cash position today, and what does the burn rate look like?
So at the end of September, which is the last time we reported, we had $198 million on our balance sheet, the strongest position we've been in the company's history. And we burn close to $2 million of cash per month.
Okay.
So you can see we're well positioned to fund half that farm with equity, continue to fund our corporate working capital through to the time where we'll be cash flow break even.
And as you're well aware, the stock's been suffering, and it's been suffering for a while. Over the last 5 years, roughly, the stock's down about 90%. Over the last year, it's down about 83%, and year to date, something like 40%. What do you make of the stock performance, and do you think that the returns are justified?
So it's difficult to speak to what happens to the stock price because there's nothing that's really driving it. Nothing's changed from the story, and we continue to hit the milestones that we've always said we would hit. We're producing in Indiana and Prince Edward Island. We're selling the product, and we have the farm in Ohio under construction. We've done everything that we said we were going to do in the time that we said we were going to do it. So the stock price is a little bit of a question mark. It peaked early part of last year for no apparent reason. I mean, I think it was a lot going on with some other stocks and the market in general. And I think we're also now seeing some of the, the challenge that small and micro cap stocks like ours are experiencing. Now, typically, it's if you're not profitable, that's typically why the market is reacting that way. But because you're going to have to go back out and try to fund the business. But we're in a really good position in terms of our cash on our balance sheet. And so there's really no reason that the stock should be trading where it is right now. Because again, nothing's changed from what we said we were going to do and what we've actually accomplished.
So what do you think investors might be missing about the story? I mean, if the stock's lost, 90% of its value in a year, certainly there's something going on that I understand stocks can be unfairly punished. I understand small, more speculative things have been hurt, especially last year. But do you feel like there's an element of the story that investors are missing or misportraying something?
So part of the strategy when we raised capital the last few times was to make sure that we had a retail element in our investor base, because we wanted to make sure that we were creating some liquidity in the stocks. If we look at our investor base with the institutionals, there's not been big changes in those institutional buyers. It has to do, I think, more with trading with the retail investor, and it's really not based on anything that we've done or said. And so I'm not really sure why it's chased itself down to the level that it is now, but we haven't seen a significant change in our institutional base, which is the majority.
And I find talking to CEOs that they often have a great perspective on both the upside and also some of the risks with their company. Do you have anything, Sylvia, that you're particularly concerned about? Anything that keeps you up at night? Not necessarily something that you're terrified, concerned about, but just something in terms of what you think might be some of the bigger challenges on the horizon for AquaBounty.
I think the one that we're keeping our eye on is relates to the farm in Ohio, because with all of the supply chain challenges that we've experienced over the last 18 months, getting materials at the right price to that farm is absolutely critically important to our future. And so that probably is the biggest unknown for us. Now, we've already started to buy out some of the construction packages to make sure that we're controlling those costs. We've got long lead time items on order, but again, given what's going on in the world today, there's no guarantee that those supply chains won't continue to be a challenge.
And how do you build that customer base? How do you get the message out there, and how do you get more people interested in your salmon?
We've done we've hired an excellent director of sales, and our chief commercial officer has about 25 years in the seafood industry. So we've been very specific about who we pursued as a customer, because they need to be able to understand the story. We've shared it with their sales teams. We make calls to their customers. And as I said, so far it's been a very receptive audience. And we'd expect that to continue. I think there's a couple other benefits that we've seen recently. The first is, COVID has actually been our friend, if you can believe it. And the reason for that is I think the consumer is starting to recognize that biotechnology is a real benefit as we think about global challenges. You know, think about what's happened in the speed to market of the COVID vaccine, that you can be highly targeted in improving nutrition and bringing products to market quickly. So I think they're starting to become more comfortable with biotechnology and the impact that it can have. And then the second was, the supply chains collapsed, and not having a domestic source of supply for salmon when there's a market of 400,000 metric tons also leads us to retailers and restaurants that really do want a domestic source of supply. And we don't have one. And so this kind of farming provides that, and it's in a very environmentally responsible way, which is also important.
And finally, Sylvia, what are you most excited about this year? What are you most excited about in 2022?
I think it's twofold. I think it's the construction of the farm in Ohio, and the fact that, that is a dream that's been on the table for a long time with all the AquaBounty teammates. So we're very excited about what that farm is going to do for us. But I think just as importantly, this is a new way of farming fish, particularly salmon. And with our 25 years of experience, we're able to take that experience and build it into a state-of-the-art facility. And some of our competitors really don't have that 25 years of raising mature salmon and the rigorous standard operating procedures that we bring to that project. And so I'm excited about that. I'm excited about the competence that we built in our R&D teams in terms of biotechnology, breeding, genetics, fish health, and nutrition. And we think that that's going to allow us to expand into near adjacencies like farming shrimp in a similar way, not necessarily genetically engineered shrimp, but using the type of farming that we do with a species that's the most well-consumed or the highest consumption globally. And so a different way of farming shrimp with our capabilities in recirculating aquaculture system presents a real opportunity. And then we think, gene editing is something that we're pursuing, and we have a competence in genetics in our R&D teams, and then also fish health and nutrition. How do we feed fish more responsibly, reducing the fish in, fish out ratio, placing less pressure on the environment? That's something else that I'm excited about, and I see what the teams are doing, and I see some real opportunity there to expand into other areas of growth.
Well, this has been fantastic, Sylvia. Best of luck moving forward, and thanks for joining us on Seeking Alpha.
Thank you, Jesse. Thanks for having me today.